Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the latest, the official podcast, the Brock Press, where we take you beyond the headlines and do a deep dive into some of the many interesting articles written by our team this week. My name is Noah Nickel. I'm editor-in-chief of the Brock Press and host of the latest, and today I'm joined by our managing editor, Holly Morrison. How are you doing today, Holly?
I'm doing pretty good. It is warming up, so that is nice. In a good mood about that, I think.
Yeah, I was really upset Sunday morning. Decided to be up early, and it was just extra early, and that was terrible. But the sun being out till 7 just kind of it kind of hits different. It's just a little bit. You miss that. You don't realize how much that motivates you and uplifts you until you just watching the sunset just after 7 o'clock is pretty glorious. This week is all Holly all the time. So usually we try to cover a good mix of articles from different authors, but just kind of how the cookies crumbled this week, it's all Holly's articles. There's nothing wrong with it. She has a great mix of topics this week, which is why it kind of just worked out this way. So the first one we'll get into is all about St. Patrick's Day and how to kind of balance having a good time with keeping the laws in mind and keeping your safety and the safety of others in mind. The second article we'll be talking about is all about WNBA star Brittney Griner and her detainment in Russia and kind of what that means on the geopolitics side and also on the WNBA side of things. And last but not least, we'll be talking about subscription services and some of the hidden costs associated with those services that we don't necessarily think about all the time. So, as I said, a great mix of topics. And, with that, we will get right into the conversation. So the first article we're going to talk about is Holly's on St. Patrick's Day. Holly shared her thoughts on St. Patrick's Day and how it's important to consider your safety, the safety of others, as well as the laws and bylaws on the books that may be at play depending on how you choose to spend your St. Patrick's Day. So, Holly, it's like I'm interviewing you about your article. I'm curious if you've ever been, big on St. Patrick's Day. Were you ever drawn into the hype at Brock and the whole Jacobson bit? I'm just curious.
I've never been to the Jacobson party. The only time that I really would have had an opportunity to do that would have been in my first year, because in my second year, that is when the pandemic started, and it was something like March 13th when all the restrictions came out, and obviously St. Patrick's Day is usually on the 17th. So I was like, I'm not gonna risk infectious disease for a street party, which kind of sucked because I do actually live pretty close to it this year, so I could have kind of just shown up and seen what all the hype was about. It is something that I felt you might as well see once, but I've never really had the opportunity to. So obviously, in my second year and in my third year, didn't really do anything. I usually do something. I'll go to a friend's house. We'll have a couple drinks. Paint some stuff green. It's just a fun little holiday. Just I guess an excuse to hang out with people. And have a good time. I'm not super into massive, huge parties. That's just not really my scene. But I definitely understand the hype and why people do it. Especially when they're 21.
Yeah, I'm pretty much in a similar boat. Not a fan of big groups of people I don't know, especially not in the last 2 years or so. But even before that, because I'm a year ahead of you, I think. 1 year, I think. In those first 2 years, I did not go to Jacobson, not really my thing. 1 year I drove past it, forgetting it was St. Patrick's Day, so that's how really into it I was that year. And that's saw it. That was good to see how insane that is and how it's totally not my thing. But yeah, hang out with some friends too. Same ideas. You were saying it's another excuse to just hang out. This time you have to wear green stuff, but easy enough to do. I'm curious your thoughts on the impact that the last years of the pandemic might have on the whole St. Patrick's Day thing at universities this year or even beyond. And if you think it might make things get a little bit more out of hand than they already sometimes do, or if it might quiet things down. If people would kind of be drawn elsewhere from having the years off. I'm curious if you think there's any lasting impact on the big university St. Patrick's Day street takeovers after the pandemic.
I think it's not necessarily like a viewpoint that I agree with, but I do think there are a lot of people, especially in university, who are kind of over it, and especially with so many restrictions being lifted, um, you know, gatherings being pretty much permitted. I think that it's going to be a thing again. I don't necessarily think it's going to get huge. I don't think it's going to turn into a massive rager in the entire city any more than it usually does. But I do definitely think it's going to be a thing. Last year the streets were totally empty. And I don't think that is going to happen again this year. I've already seen a lot of people talking about plans, a lot of people being because I guess, I was in my first year, the year before the pandemic. And so that would have been the last year that most people who are now fourth years would have been able to do it. So there's a lot of people who I see on my Instagram who are we got to keep the tradition alive. We got to make sure that everyone knows that this is a thing that happens here. So yeah, I think it's just it's gonna happen. No matter how many don't put the bad in Badger flyers get handed out.
But my last question, and bear with me as I kind of explain it. I use the word harm reduction here, which is not necessarily correct, but it encompasses the idea of what I'm getting at. Because as we know, having gone to Brock, and I mean, at any university, they have their own little version of it. It's all, or I don't remember, is it Laurier or Waterloo that has that huge one on that street, Ezra Avenue, that gigantic one? Do you remember?
I think it's Laurier.
I think it's Laurier. I think so too. But anyways, they all do their own big things like this. I get it. But every year, we know that Brock sends out the flyers and they send out the staff to people's doors and they send out the press releases and they send out all these communications to your student email. They're relentless in trying to stop what happens every year. In just they're relentless, and yet they do essentially very little in terms of actually trying to stop it. So I'm just curious if you think there's maybe a more aggressive way, akin to say a harm reduction strategy or approach, to say look, these kids are going to have some type of street party thing. Why not? Or why don't we work with the city to try to get a permit to hold a more structured festival type thing? You know what I mean? Where you could even charge a little bit for entry, but then it's you could have a concert, or you could have actual vendors for alcohol and stuff to control that, and having a sectioned off space where it's actually is legal because they have their license for that event to serve and consume alcohol. So I'm just curious of your thoughts on that type of idea of making it, keeping its spirit of what people want from it, which is essentially an open air, big crowd of, hordes of people, but trying to maybe reel in some of the climbing on telephone poles and, standing on people's roofs and vandalizing neighborhoods, which is what people get really, obviously, understandably angry about.
Yeah, like I definitely, one of the things that I definitely wanted to try to communicate in the article was like, you're not going to stop a bunch of university students from getting belligerently drunk on St. Patrick's Day. That's just not going to work. You can't wag your finger at them enough that they're going to be like, "Oh yes, you're right. You're right, Mr. Brock. I should not shotgun a beer on this roof." Um so like that's not going to happen. So yeah, I think like obviously like you get into like some gray area with like the idea that like it becomes a university sanctioned event and then the university is responsible for all the stuff that happens. But they're doing like St. Patrick's Day events at Isaac's. They serve alcohol at Isaac's. There are definitely Brock events where alcohol is served and like drinking is allowed. Like that's not a new concept or a new idea. And like I generally think that like most people who go to like the St. Patrick's Day parties aren't really there to like you know, cause a whole bunch of damage. They're mostly just there to like hang out with their friends and be a little bit rowdy, and be a little bit noisy. Which that's fine. That happens every St. Patrick's Day. That's not something that's unique to universities. People get loud and people get drunk at 2 p.m. on a Thursday, and that's just how it goes. Um, so I think trying to sort of maintain the spirit of that, the idea that people want to be outside drinking beers, hanging out, early in spring. That's I think like a reasonable thing to want to do. It's like just a couple of people who like take advantage of the fact that like it is unsupervised and like to an extent it's like not sanctioned by anybody. It is technically illegal. Once you like step off of someone's front lawn and you're holding a drink, that's then against the law. So there are definitely people who will take advantage of that fact to just like black out and like do dumb stuff. And I think the idea that like students get a bad reputation in St. Catharines sometimes for being loud and annoying and partying. But I also think if you live in a university town, especially a university student neighborhood, that's just something that's going to happen. People do that, and you do have to live with the fact that people are living their lives. But I also think that like if you pick up your beer cans and if you don't get on the roof of a suburban family home and you don't, try to knock over a telephone pole, people will be less mad at you for having this party, if that makes sense. So just having ways to like prevent most of that like mischief that goes on. And I think having more official events and having, maybe even a permit for like a block party would make a lot of sense.
I think it would go, a long way in making it more appealing, to a larger part of the Brock community, and wouldn't be as off-putting necessarily when you hear the horror stories and stuff, right? And having a first aid tent would go probably a long way in saving people from when they inevitably trip and fall on the street and scrape up their face and their arms and things, right? Like there's just so many things that could be done by charging people like I don't know, like $10 to come in, like, and just keeping it pretty loose, but at the same time having those types of like essentially like amenities in place, like those resources available, in the moment, that would go a long way to helping kind of the average goer, right? The average like party goer enjoy themselves more, while also reining in some of the crazier elements.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I've said it in like articles before, but I'm not anti jumping through tables. I'm not like anti going a little bit crazy and insane at a party. I don't think that that's necessarily an inherently terrible and evil thing to do at the age of 21. I think that is part of, you know, kids will be kids kind of thing. I'd rather people have like stupid fun in a safe way than stupid fun in a very dangerous way. Um, so yeah, I think it does sort of boil down to the idea of like have your stupid fun, but also know that like you could get hurt, other people could get hurt, you could, get arrested if you do something stupid enough. Um, and like, just don't be a total, complete and total menace.
I think all we can agree on is that going door to door and wagging their finger at people is pretty much the least Brock can do, and it really does next to nothing to actually help anyone or do anything positive for this stuff.
Yeah, it truly just becomes a joke. Like, don't put the bat in Badger is it sounds like something you would tell like a kindergarten class. And I think if Brock does like a better job of like because the vast majority of students are adults. You might have the odd 17-year-old like I was when I started. Um, but the vast majority of the people at Brock University are over 18 years old. A lot of them are over 19 years old, can legally drink, can legally do a lot of stuff that, maybe you might not want them to do, but they're gonna do it. So just like treat them like adults, um, and just, don't don't treat us like kindergarten students. Know that like we're gonna do it whether you like it or not. And, if you don't like it, maybe be a little bit more proactive in finding ways to make it better and safer. All right, so the second article that we're going to talk about from this week, also coincidentally written by me. Noah did pick the articles this week. This was not me picking all of my opinions to talk about, just putting that out there. But I wrote about Brittney Griner, who, if you're not familiar with women's basketball, she's one of the most dominant players in the league. She's a star player. She plays for the Phoenix Mercury in the WNBA. But about a month ago, she was detained in Russia on basically an accusation of drug possession. That it was sort of accused that she had vaping paraphernalia and cannabis oil in her luggage when she was trying to clear customs. And so I talked about some of the wider factors and considerations that are at play. There are some who say that she might be being used as sort of a pseudo political hostage by the Russians, just given everything that is going on in the world. She was detained about a week before the invasion of Ukraine. So that certainly is a theory that holds a little bit of water. But at the same time, I also talked about why she had to be in Russia in the first place. You might sort of wonder, what the hell is an American basketball player doing in Russia at the end of February? But I sort of talked about the reality that a lot of WNBA players will go overseas to countries like Russia, China. They go over to play in the EuroLeague, which is where they can make, $1 million contracts, which is not what they make in the WNBA. So Noah, I guess I just wanted to ask you, you're not a big sports person, but you are a big politics person. So I guess I just wanted to ask if you had heard about what was happening with Brittney Griner. Was this kind of a news story that I guess caught attention outside of the sports world?
It definitely had, but not for me. So when you said you were going to write about it last week, at that point I did look it up and learned a little bit at that time. But then since then I've seen, I have seen stories about it come up. And so I'm thinking it was one of those things where I just, the photo with the articles, right, is the photo of her playing basketball. And so I'm assuming I just would glaze over it. You know what I mean? Like it would be there, and I'd say, "Oh, some basketball story, cool, whatever. Okay, keep moving." I'm assuming that's why. But now, since you've written about it, and since you brought it up last week, they were going to write about it. Now it's one of those things that now I know what I'm looking for. I kind of have noticed it cropping up more and more.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely something that I heard about because, I'm a WNBA fan. I follow WNBA reporters on Twitter, and definitely when the news broke that it was Brittney Griner who had been detained, we were all kind of like, what's going on here? Just because they're sort of like, when you go to play overseas in Russia as an American women's basketball player, there's this sort of unspoken agreement that you will be inherently protected by ownership. I touched on it in the article. Brittney Griner is like openly gay. She's married to a woman. She's 6'9". She's a black woman. She's very outspoken. Those are not necessarily things that gel with, being in Russia. And a lot of people sort of who weren't super familiar with the idea of WNBA players playing overseas sort of pointed out. But you sort of, I guess, have to understand that there is this idea that, like, the general agreement is like you go overseas, you make $1 million, you hardly ever have to leave your apartment, your owners have cars for you. You, as long as you are like quiet and mind your own business, other people will mind your own business. Like, nobody before now really cared that there were Americans playing in the EuroLeague. So that was one, I guess, nuance that I sort of latched onto really early on when I first heard about it, and sort of thought was, I guess, important to note in the article, that, like, it's not unusual for WNBA players to spend a large chunk of their year in Russia. So I guess I also just wanted to ask, obviously the situation is super complicated. There's a lot going on. I don't think she's been formally charged with anything yet. There's just the accusation that she had drug paraphernalia in her luggage, which, in and of itself is a whole can of worms. But I guess I just wanted to ask, do you think that, like, I guess professional sports leagues should take this as kind of an indication or like a warning that they need to do a better job of taking care of players so that they don't feel like they have to spend their off seasons overseas? Before the argument was like they could get injured and not be able to play in the WNBA, but now the argument is like they could literally get detained by a country, who is actively invading another country.
Well, for that argument, I think it's bolstered by the fact of who it is who's been detained. Like a big star essentially for their league. So if they, they run any risk of, Brittney not being ready to play when the season is back, then of course, right, that's when it becomes real for the league. So I can see that argument being helped. I mean, that's not necessarily the most tactful way to put it, but essentially being bolstered by the fact that, it's kind of a big star who is being detained. Otherwise, I don't think they feel that would fall on them per se, right? It's kind of like, the people who are working multiple jobs for, say like minimum wage, right? Like, they're individual employers. A lot of their employment contracts probably say that they can't have multiple jobs. I know that was the case in one of the retail jobs I had. It was said that you couldn't be working at another retailer. But about 90% of the staff had multiple, right? They were working multiple jobs because they weren't getting enough hours at one place, so they weren't making enough money. So they had at this clothing store and that clothing store, you name it, in direct violation of this part of their contract. But so long as it didn't interfere with that, the one job, everyone kind of turned the other way. So I'm assuming that the league would just get mad at players, right? Because if it's interfering with their work with their league, then they would be upset, right? So I don't see them changing from that view. Only, it only kind of is a little bit different in this case because of the profile of the situation and the profile of the athlete, which might lend that a little bit more weight, help it go a little bit further. But also just have to see. I'm not a sports analyst, so this is me kind of talking with as much background as I have, but that's very limited.
Yeah, I also think it's like definitely a weird situation just because of the way that, like, like I've said this before, but professional sports is a weird job to have, but especially women's professional sports is a very weird job to have because there is the expectation that you have a side hustle. And at least in women's basketball, the side hustle is more basketball. In other women's sports, the side hustle is like Uber Eats driver, which is messed up in a whole lot of ways. Uh, but I digress. In like the situation with the WNBA, it's like this is not an uncommon thing to do. It is the vast majority of WNBA players go overseas during the off season. The vast majority of coaching staffs even go overseas during the off season. Like the coaching staff for the club that Brittney Griner plays at in Russia, well, played at the Russian teams in the EuroLeague have been, suspended given the everything that's going on. But like they were all Phoenix Mercury coaching staff, so it is like kind of like it's almost endorsed by the league, which I think is kind of weird because they are kind of like not advocating, but like permitting their players to go make the majority of their money somewhere else. And that can be super problematic for them, I think, even just because of the way that like athletes are like to an extent everyone's labor is a commodity. But like athletes' labor is like particularly, I think, a unique commodity just because the particular skill set that one athlete has is very unique. So like it was like a couple years ago that Brianna Stewart, who's a very good WNBA player, got super hurt playing overseas in Russia and she couldn't play the rest of the WNBA season, and it was sort of in her contract that she still had to be paid for the WNBA season even though she had been injured overseas. So it's just this like weird situation in professional sports, but women's professional sports, where it's like it's permitted and like almost sanctioned by the league. But I think like the idea, this like should be kind of like I guess a wake up call for them because the WNBA is definitely in a position right now where they can't afford to raise salaries for a lot of players, and like I would argue should, so that they don't feel the need to go overseas. You're protecting, you're like I hate referring to people as assets, but in the context of professional sports, athletes are both employers and assets. So you're protecting your assets by paying them well enough that they aren't going to go hang out in Russia for the summer and, tear their Achilles or worse, get detained.
Yeah, it depends how much if they truly see them that way, because the other way you could think about it is like as from my complete outsider sports perspective, there's like I can name on two hands professional athletes, really maybe like 2 dozen, maybe 2 dozen. I can across like all sports basically. Like I could probably maybe name 2 dozen athletes that stick out to me, and those ones are the ones that are the whales, right? They're the ones who are the golden geese. They're the ones making the huge sums of money that we hear about, the astronomical amounts of money. Those ones are, in my eyes, the assets. Those are the ones that get eyeballs on the sport and get people like me to know enough to at least maybe consider buying a ticket to go to a game with some friends who might care a little bit more than me, or that will get me to watch like the championship game of some sport or whatever, right? Like, or get me to buy some product that they have their sponsorship deal with. Like, those are the assets in my mind. And so if they're not like that, then they are more just employees first. And as we know, employees are very expendable in just about every industry. And yeah, the work they do in sports, professional sports, is very unique, and you do need more specialized skill set than most jobs. But at the end of the day, if you're not that type of an asset, maybe they do just see them as expendable to the next up and comer, or to get someone from another team and get some like rookie on the bench or whatever. I don't want to use sports terminology that I don't know, so forgive me. But you know what you see what I'm trying to say, or what I'm trying to articulate?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the main reason that I think that it should be, a wake up call for the WNBA
Oh,
is the
sorry,
fact that
sorry. Let me
yeah,
reiterate. I agree with you. I'm just
yeah,
trying to see it from. I do think people should be paid more so they don't have to risk their lives in countries that are not safe to be working at in the best of times. I do agree with you. I'm just trying to wrap my head around how I see the league's perspective. But anyways, I'll let you go.
yeah, absolutely. I just think it's Brittney Griner, and obviously you probably won't know this because you don't follow sports that closely. Brittney Griner makes more money than most WNBA players. She's on a supermax contract, which means that she makes the most money that it is possible to make in the WNBA, and she still sees it as a necessity economically to play overseas. The best women's athletes, in the WNBA still see it as a necessity to play overseas. So, even if you don't care about the people at the, lower end of the lineup, the people who aren't your starters, these are your starters going overseas. These are, the irreplaceable assets. Like, it's, it's hard to say that someone is irreplaceable. There isn't anyone else who can do the things that Brittney Griner can do. She's 6'9". She has massive hands. She can dunk, which is not a skill set that a lot of people in women's basketball have. So, she is inherently irreplaceable at this moment in time. And even making the most money that it's possible to make, she still feels that it's a necessity to go play in Russia for several months out of the year. So that's, I think, why, for me, I think that it's, it should be like, hey, these are your stars doing this. It's not the people at the bottom of your lineup doing this. Yeah, they are doing that. But, if you only care about money and if you only care about irreplaceable assets, it's the irreplaceable assets that are doing this.
Yeah, and that's what I said to answer your first question. I think this might be, or not your first question, but the second question earlier. I think this might be a time where they do care, right? Because she is in such a unique position, because of the situation is so extreme, got so quickly out of hand in Russia, and that has so much press attention. It's having this her detainment is bleeding into that coverage, right? So I do think if there's an opportunity for that case to be made that you're saying, like for the league to care, this seems like that opportunity. It's kind of remains to be seen if they feel that type of pressure. But yeah.
Yeah, I sure hope they do.
Yeah.
There are some real good owners in the WNBA, and there are some real sleazy ones who are just real jerks.
The
I
only
guess.
one I remember is the that one lady who was recently a senator. I remember her and her team hated her.
Oh, yeah, she got booted so hard by her team. It was really.
That's funny.
It was a sight to behold. I really enjoyed just them rocking up just in shirts that say "vote for whoever was running against her." I thought that was brilliant. But I guess speaking of politics, um, I guess do you sort of buy into the theory that there were political motivations behind her detention? Obviously, they knew she would be coming, and presumably they knew they would be invading Ukraine a couple days after she showed up.
Hmm. It, hmm. That's tough. That is really tough. Um, I don't know if they would have done it preemptive. Well, I say that, and then they preemptively invaded Ukraine. But I want to take it back to like another recent kind of high profile political hostage situation that was undoubtedly a political hostage situation, right? There was no question because it was just so clear and the lines were very direct. And that was with China, which I've written about a few times. I actually touched on it this week also. In with the whole Huawei case, where their one of their executives was detained in Canada and was to be extradited to the States, and in response to that, China arbitrarily detained two Canadian men who were in China at the time. And wouldn't you know, once the case was dropped against that Huawei executive, those two Canadians returned home very, very shortly afterwards. So that, to me, is how I see the political hostage thing. And I know it doesn't always have to be black and white and clear as day like that. But that offers a very clear example, right? It was used as a retaliatory measure by a country that does not, respect rule of law, and regularly engages in political, detainment and imprisonment. Yeah, so that example to me feels and looks different than this one does. But at the same time, it could have been part of kind of their it could be part of their larger kind of approach to things, right? Because they came into Ukraine saying one thing, but as we've learned since, with their ulterior motives ready to go and not really far behind the kind of veneer they set up of what, the reasoning for invading. So I do think it's possible, but it might be like, I don't know that, removing the sanctions, the new sanctions that were brought in because with this Ukrainian situation, I don't know if that would mean that Brittney gets to go home the next, I don't necessarily see the direct connection in the same way as other political hostage situations, but I'm not an expert. I don't have any info on that. So it's certainly possible I'm wrong, but it feels like the situation is a bit beyond that. You know what I mean? Like, it's beyond that scope. Like, he's threatening. I mean, Putin's been threatening nukes for a while now, right? For a few weeks now. So I don't know if this fits into the contained kind of world of the political hostage negotiation, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, I think you're right. I don't think the initial, at least the initial arrest was politically motivated. I don't know, because obviously I'm not a WNBA expert. That is not my sport management area of study, of expertise, of choice. That was not a sentence that made sense. But it's just not super, a league that I am in and following as much as other leagues. So I think, I guess the theory that I've been sort of thinking over in my head is just the idea that, with the invasion of Ukraine and the way that Russia is separating itself from just the West, I think those protections that basketball players had come to expect, just the ability to live their lives, I think those degraded very, very rapidly. And I think what that could have resulted in is players getting in trouble for things that they would not have gotten in trouble for last year. So I think that could be what happened. I'm not an expert, but I definitely think, it is important to treat the case, to get her home, to treat it as a criminal case and not a political one, because I think raising the political profile of it doesn't do much to help. Her family is very much asked, we're just going to be quiet and we're going to treat this as a criminal case, whether we think she's guilty or not, just to get her home.
Yeah. I mean, this is not to blame athletes. Like you said, they see it as a massive money-making opportunity, and they should be paid more at home, of course. But in the current context, I get the desire to do work in other countries. But it is important to have, just for everyone's own safety, to have a working understanding of the countries you're choosing to work in, and not do business with the country itself. Obviously, it's not how it works, but the countries you're doing business in, because you run the risk of your personal safety. Whether your decision to work there was political or not, you're existing in the world, and so you're at the whim of the political conditions of the countries you're working in. So there's always that risk there, and Russia is a dicey one to be doing business with. Again, it's not to blame the athletes, like you said. It should be putting more pressure on the leagues, of course, the American leagues. Um, but yeah, there's always a risk. You're kind of taking that on whether you choose to be political or not. I use air quotes because I kind of hate that everything that we do is political, whether you choose to know about it or not, or is your choice to be ignorant or not. But I think it's a bit of a cop out when people say that. But that's another topic for another day.
Yeah, I think it's massively complicated and just a weird situation for a person to be in. But yeah, I just sort of wanted to write about it a little bit, touch on all of the things that are going on because there are so many things going on with that situation. But I think my main takeaway from it, basically, I wanted to write about it because I saw someone on Twitter, and they were like, if Brittney Griner was an NBA player, there'd be like a White House memo about this, and we'd be doing everything to get her home. And I was just kind of sitting there like, if Brittney Griner was an NBA player, she would not have been in Russia. And that was, I think, my big takeaway from the whole thing. All right. So the last article that I wrote this week, we're going 3 for 3. I read about subscription services. It was slightly another one of my Old Man Yells at Cloud articles. But I wrote about how, they kind of promise a low cost and, endless content. You're also giving up ownership of like things in exchange for those sort of low upfront costs. And, while this can be a choice in some places, like with subscription services, in other places, specifically the example I used was Adobe and Creative Cloud, it's the only option, which I think should concern everyone who's buying stuff. So no, I guess I just wanted to ask, why do you think people have been sort of like chill with giving up ownership in so many areas? Is it just like the low cost, or do you think there's like something else going on?
The low cost is enticing, and I remember when Apple Music was kind of new, or at least newer to me. I remember kind of doing the calculation and realizing it would take decades to purchase the amount of music I ended up, downloading through that. So to me, the cost made sense, or at least the current costs. Again, all that is subject to change without our control, as well as the library stuff, which you talked about. There could be other things at play that kind of goes into areas I'm not qualified to say definitively on. But I mean, I could see that being a reality, right? There's been a massive movement, whether people wanted to necessarily or not, towards renting, especially for our age group now, as we're people our age and slightly older are trying to join the housing market, and are learning that that's much harder than they originally thought. Renting is becoming much more of a norm in that area. And beyond that, I think just creating that kind of social condition of like, separating people from ownership, which I think has been going on for a while. I think socially you can kind of create like a buy-in, essentially, like an unconscious or subconscious buy-in to that idea, and it can kind of spread from there to things that you don't need to necessarily own, and then the price just kind of is the cherry on the cake that makes it justifiable, right? So I think, in short, yeah, I think there are social pressures and kind of social norms that are changing that are giving rise to like subscription services and getting rid of like ownership. But I think it might be hard to put it necessarily like understand how much of a cause that is versus just knowing you can pay $5 a month and have access to thousands of songs, right? For one example.
Yeah, totally. And I think like maybe with like Spotify and other like music streaming services, it's also like, I guess maybe like the devaluing of music. Like anyone can make music and upload it. A lot of people are like, why should I pay like $20 for an album with 12 songs when I can pay like, I pay the student price when I can pay like $4.99 a month for any song I want anytime, unless, as happened last week on Tuesday, Spotify goes down. And I know as an Apple Music guy, you had no problems. But it sure did throw a wrench into my day. I had to listen to music on YouTube like it was 2011. YouTube music mixes, not good. Just want to throw that out there. They're real bad. But yeah, I guess should something like that be like a cautionary tale, or is it just kind of, an inconvenience? I guess I kind of saw it as like the platforms that you use are not permanent. Something could happen to anything on them, and it's entirely without your control, even if you're paying for it.
Yeah, I think that was the first time for a lot of people to really, not that they didn't necessarily know, oh yeah, I know this isn't my music, and Apple is control and blah blah blah. I mean, we see it probably more with platforms like Netflix, where it's like shows come and go on there. We get that, but never have we really been faced with like they can also go out of business, or they could also stop whatever they're doing whenever they wanted to, or even when they don't want to, like in the Spotify case, right, where the server went down or whatever happened. They had some type of server maintenance that they had to fix. So like, I think that was the first time people really addressed that, and they're like, at the end of the day, I've been paying for however many years per month, and I'm not. Equity is a weird way to talk about music, but I'm not building like my ownership of any of this, right? I'm not. At the end of the day, I have nothing if this goes away, right? That the agreement just gives them all the power, and I just get along for the ride for my $5 or $10 a month until they pack up and leave town, and yeah, you're left with nothing. So I think this was the first time that a lot of people really were faced with that, and it was probably a little bit jarring and a little bit concerning. But yeah, as an Apple Music user, I didn't have any of that, and I still haven't. I'm still blissfully unaware that I could lose my music at any time.
I'm so happy for you. Meanwhile, I had to spend Tuesday morning with the sound of my own head. Who wants that?
Who
But I
wants
guess
to listen to their own thoughts?
yeah, God, on a Tuesday morning especially, like there's nothing good going on in there. It's really hollow.
Or you get what is it, 3 ads on YouTube sometimes they'll do in a row before you can get into the video.
It was also like every single no matter what YouTube mix I clicked on, every single YouTube mix led me back to Uptown Girl by Billy Joel. No matter what. No matter where I started. Which I think
Not the worst song.
Not the worst song, but I started at Taylor Swift. So I guess just the last thing that I want to ask about like subscription and like versus ownership is like, do you think there can be room for like the streaming subscription models as an option, or is it too pervasive that it should be maybe like banned or like just like not as accepted?
I think it has a bit of an inevitability to take over, and I don't think any of that's natural. Like, I think that's all manufactured to be that way, right? Like, we know that, well, not necessarily everyone knows, but it's kind of, it is public knowledge that a lot of companies, for the first many years that they're in business now, this is more common nowadays, but like for sometimes decades, their investors will, cover for their losses year after year after year. They won't post a profit for, as I said, over a decade sometimes. And the point is to essentially get people hooked, so to speak, to undercut the existing kind of competition, the existing structure that's offering that product or service to people. And once you've killed off that natural competition, you kind of let things ride a little bit more, and you ask them to pay a bit more per month, or the service gets lesser quality, or you get another tier in there for the premium ultra VIP tier that costs X amount of money, right? All those things kind of start to creep in at that point. And like that's common in like the ride sharing world, in food delivery world, in streaming. I know for at least for like streaming like movies and TV show content, like that world for sure. A lot of those companies are taking huge losses year after year after year, with the point of replacing networks and wiping out movie theaters and so on and so forth, to get to a point where they, the competition is so kind of controlled by them, is so weak and feeble that they're able to charge the price that will actually make them money hand over fist. And we're kind of in that point now where the mask is starting to come off with that. People are starting to be like, okay, this is a little too many streaming services. All right, this one's getting a little too expensive per month to keep going. And like that realization, I think, will come too late to go back after a certain point. You know what I mean? Like you won't have the option for other options. And that's like a purposeful plan that is being kind of carried out in a lot of industries. So to protect consumers, I guess the best thing would to be not to have subscription models, but it's at the same time, I don't feel like that's the government's place to tell people that they don't want to pay $5 a month or $10 a month for unlimited access to music and TV shows, right? Like it seems outside of the reach necessarily of government, but it's like there's a clear end game here that's kind of been pretty well publicly like made clear, and it definitely is not good for consumers, and people will be angry when that time comes. But it's how do you regulate that without looking way too aggressive and paternalistic?
Yeah, I think I definitely agree. It's like they're reinventing the wheel and then waiting for the wheel, to be too expensive, and then they're jacking up the prices for the new and improved wheel that is exactly the same as the old wheel. So I think it's just how business and capitalism works. Um, you know, People are gonna get suckered by all this stuff, and there's not a whole lot that we can do about it. Um, but I do still think that I'm right for collecting DVDs. I think that I am correct for doing that, so that I never lose my favorite movies. I'm the winner.
Yeah, I think you'll be proven right in history for that, honestly, especially over people who, because even now, like quote unquote ownership of stuff, like actually buying movies these days, if you buy them digitally, like those are the biggest suckers. No offense to anyone that does that, but like buying a movie today and you buy it from like a digital platform, you are you are being way worse screwed over than the people with the Netflix subscription, because you're still paying more than those people and you actually don't own it, because again, it's still tied to a platform. If you look at the fine print of some of those things, like you still will lose access to that if the platform goes down, or if you don't have your membership to that, like you can't download that off of that platform. So like even that world of ownership is getting kind of perverted by this whole fully digital move, and the kind of like anti-ownership kind of move we're seeing in this and other related and fields.
Yeah, I will be proven correct by history when my DVD copy of Wayne's World 2 is the only remaining copy, because they took it off of Netflix or something like that.
Yeah, they talk about people fighting wars over water, but it'll really be over access to DVDs.
Yeah, it'll be my Ghostbusters DVD.
A hot commodity.
Yeah, I think so.
And that does it for another episode of The Latest. Thank you, Holly, for joining me to talk about all of your great articles this week. Thanks for writing them too. They were fun to talk about. And thank you all for listening. We really appreciate it. Remember that you'll find all the articles Holly wrote this week that we talked about, and the rest of us wrote stuff too. Don't be fooled. It's all available on our website at www.rockpress.com. You can also find us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. On top of following us on social media, checking out the website, you can also be sure to follow the podcast so you don't miss an episode. Find us on Apple Podcasts. You'll find us on Spotify, Google Podcasts, Anchor, Breaker, you name it. Anywhere you listen to podcasts, you'll find The Latest. Also on our website and our YouTube channel, we post it there as well. And with all of that said, I'd like to thank you again for listening, and we will see you next week for another episode.